Titanic had been missing at the bottom of the ocean for decades until 1985. That's when Robert Ballard located the wreckage about 400 miles off the coast of Newfoundland.
History has long painted the Titanic as a victim of chance.
In the depths of the Atlantic lies the wreck of the Titanic. But more than a century after the ship sank, new technology is shedding light on what happened on that fateful night.
Lost to an iceberg on her first voyage. At 83, Robert Ballard tells the truth about the Titanic wreck. What he found proved the ship did not simply fall to nature. Poor construction, corporate greed, and pride, disguised as progress, had already written her fate. The Titanic was not just unlucky, she was built to fail. Let's explore how. Back in the year 1985, a young ocean explorer named Robert Ballard took on a mission that would soon change history. He traveled deep into the cold, dark waters of the North Atlantic Ocean. Almost 2.5 miles below the surface, he came across something the world had been waiting to see for more than 70 years. The legendary Titanic, once called unsinkable, finally revealed itself. The great ship was lying on the ocean floor, broken, bent, and silent, yet still recognizable. This discovery made headlines worldwide. Ballard quickly became famous, celebrated as the man who solved one of the greatest mysteries in history. But time always moves forward, and now, after almost 40 years, Robert Ballard is an old man. As he looks back on his life, he has chosen to share truths that he kept hidden for decades. He explains that what he saw on the ocean floor was not simply the sad story everyone had heard. Instead, the wreck bore signs of greed, pride, and perhaps even secrets that had never been told. As the old saying goes, truth crushed to earth shall rise again. So this is not only a story about history, this is Robert Ballard's own confession. To understand why this discovery mattered so much, it helps to know more about the man himself. Robert Ballard's connection to the sea began when he was very young. He was born in 1942 and later joined the United States Navy during the Cold War. There he trained in sonar technology and how to guide submarines through the depths. While many of his fellow officers dreamed of one day leading ships or commanding fleets, Ballard's dreams were different. He was drawn to the mysteries that lay hidden beneath the waves. More than anything, he wanted to go where no human eyes had ever looked before. In the 1970s, Robert Ballard introduced an idea that would forever change deep-sea exploration. He began creating and testing remotely operated vehicles, also known as ROVs. These were robotic cameras attached to long cables that could dive into the darkest, deepest parts of the ocean. Unlike human divers, these machines can survive the crushing water pressure that increases in intensity the deeper you go. At such depths, the pressure can crush metal and destroy equipment, but Ballard's machines were built to endure it. At first, many scientists and naval officers were skeptical. Some thought the machines were too fragile, while others believed nothing could replace the courage of divers. But Ballard was certain that the future of ocean discovery belonged to machines. He explained that robots could go farther, stay longer, and see more than any human ever could. While others doubted him, he continued to refine his designs, convinced that these machines would unlock the hidden mysteries of the deep sea. Out of all the mysteries that lay beneath the waves, one ship pulled at his imagination more than any other: the Titanic. The Titanic was not simply a ship. When it launched in 1912, it was promoted as the greatest engineering marvel of its time. People called it unsinkable and saw it as proof that human progress had no limits. The Titanic was decorated with luxury, filled with the finest technology, and celebrated as the pride of the modern age. But that dream ended on its very first trip. While sailing across the North Atlantic, the Titanic struck an iceberg and sank into the sea. More than 1,500 men, women, and children lost their lives in the freezing water. It was one of the worst maritime disasters in history. The world mourned. Newspapers carried heartbreaking stories, and families waited for answers. Yet very soon, the story began to change. The hard questions about why the ship sank were pushed aside. Important facts about the company's poor choices, the warnings that had been ignored, and the design flaws that made the ship weaker than advertised were softened or hidden. Instead, the world was given a cleaner tale of a beautiful ship that had been unlucky. This version of the story was easier to accept, but it was not the full truth. For more than 70 years, the Titanic's exact location remained unknown, and in that time, the myths grew stronger than the facts. To Robert Ballard, this silence was not romantic or poetic. He saw it as a painful gap in history. He wanted the truth, not a legend. He believed the real wreck could tell a story that no book or survivor's account could ever tell. And in 1985, with help from the United States Navy, his team finally found what so many people had been searching for. On the dark floor of the ocean, the bow of the Titanic slowly came into view. Out of the pitch-black emptiness, the enormous shape appeared like a ghost, standing silent after decades underwater. The ship looked majestic in its size, but also broken, twisted, and shattered. Its power and weakness were frozen together in a haunting image. The world was stunned. Headlines praised Robert Ballard as a hero, the man who solved the greatest maritime riddle in history. People were excited by the images and the mystery finally being revealed. But for Ballard, the discovery carried another layer of truth. He realized the Titanic was not just evidence of a tragic accident caused by an iceberg, it was also a symbol of a larger tragedy. The wreck itself showed signs of human mistakes, greed, and arrogance. The choices made in company offices and the decisions taken on the ship before the crash had played just as big a role as the iceberg itself. When Robert Ballard's underwater machines finally reached the Titanic, it felt like stepping into another world. The robotic cameras sank deeper and deeper into the Atlantic Ocean, moving through a blackness so heavy it seemed endless. The deeper they went, the more the silence pressed in upon them. There was no light, no sound, only the crushing force of water from every direction. After what felt like an eternity, shapes slowly began to appear. Pieces of coal dotted the seabed, and scraps of twisted metal lay scattered across the sand. Then, out of the darkness, the most famous part of the ship came into view. The bow of the Titanic rose up from the ocean floor, massive and still, like a shadow frozen in time. The ship had been lost for more than 70 years, and now it stood before the cameras as though waiting to tell its story. The sight was unsettling. Strange formations, created by bacteria that fed on the iron, hung down the sides like long icicles. Heavy anchor chains still rested in their places. Bent and broken railings looked almost ready to hold passengers leaning over them. The ship was not just a wreck of rusting metal. It felt as if time itself had stopped around it. What struck Ballard the most, though, was the stillness. The Titanic was no longer a display of engineering power. It had become something else entirely, a mass grave. As the cameras continued to explore, evidence of the people who had once been there began to appear. Shoes lay together on the seabed, showing where lives had ended side by side. Pieces of clothing clung to bits of luggage. Small personal items were spread across the sand, like reminders of interrupted journeys. The wreck was not simply a broken ship. It was a resting place for over 1,000 souls. But along with the sadness came another realization. The Titanic had not gone down the way many survivors had described. For decades, people believed the ship had sunk to the bottom of the water in one piece. The remains told a harsher story. The vessel had ripped apart violently. Parts of the hull had peeled away. Rivets had given out. Steel beams were bent and twisted into unnatural shapes. The Titanic had not drifted peacefully into the deep. Its final moments were violent and destructive, showing clear signs of structural weakness. The disaster was not just the work of ice and cold water. The ship itself had failed. At 83, Robert Ballard tells the truth about the Titanic wreck. Robert Ballard quickly realized what the wreck was revealing. The Titanic's loss was not only caused by an iceberg drifting in its path. The ship had been betrayed by the very materials and methods used to build it. The evidence of weak rivets, fragile steel, and rushed workmanship was carved into the wreck itself. These flaws made the ship vulnerable long before it struck the ice. Standing before that evidence, Ballard grasped the harsh reality. The Titanic was more than a final resting place. It was also proof of human mistakes, almost like a crime scene frozen at the bottom of the sea. As Ballard and his team continued to examine the remains, the ship began to reveal its own version of events, one that was very different from the story the world had accepted for more than 7 decades. The first sign came from how the wreck lay on the ocean floor. The bow and stern were not connected, as many had imagined. They were separated by almost 2,000 feet, with a wide trail of wreckage spread between them. Survivors had often spoken of the Titanic sinking in one piece, slipping beneath the waves in a single motion. The wreck showed something else entirely. The ship had broken apart as it went down. The breakup was violent. Boilers, beams, and pieces of equipment were scattered across the seabed, like pieces from a shattered puzzle. This was not a graceful descent, but a collapse that ripped the vessel into fragments. When Ballard studied the outer walls of the ship, the damage revealed even more. In some places, the steel plates had curled outward as if peeled back by a giant hand. Rivets had burst apart, leaving jagged openings along the seams. Later studies by engineers confirmed the significance of these details. The rivets had been made from lower quality wrought iron, which was more likely to snap under pressure. Even the steel itself was found to be brittle in cold temperatures, making the ship weaker than anyone had admitted. So, when the iceberg struck, it was not just the blow of nature that doomed the Titanic. The real danger had already been built into the ship itself. For many years, people believed the sinking of the Titanic was simply nature proving stronger than human invention. The story was often told as a lesson in humility, showing how a single iceberg could bring down the world's most advanced ship. But the wreck revealed something different. The disaster was not only about ice and cold water. It was about choices made by the ship's builders and owners, shortcuts in construction, cheaper materials, and the overconfident claim that the Titanic could never sink sealed its fate long before it left the port of Southampton. When the evidence from the wreck was compared with survivor accounts, those old memories suddenly made more sense. Some passengers had reported hearing the sound of tearing metal and groaning noises as the ship went under. At the time, many officials dismissed those words, saying the ship had sunk gracefully and in one piece. But the twisted steel of the wreck confirmed the truth. The Titanic had not slipped beneath the waves quietly. It had been torn apart by its own weaknesses. The lifeboats added another layer of tragedy. The Titanic carried only 20 lifeboats, enough for about half of the people on board. This was not an accident or an oversight. At the time, safety rules counted lifeboats by the size of a ship, not by how many passengers it carried. White Star Line executives used this rule to keep the lifeboat number low. More lifeboats would have meant extra cost, less deck space, and a less elegant appearance. For the company, style took precedence over safety. Ballard's underwater footage made the consequences of this decision clear. The cameras showed davits, the boat cranes designed to lower lifeboats, still fixed on the wreck. They were strong, unused, and waiting for boats that had never been placed there. That single image reminded the world how many more people might have survived if the ship had simply been equipped with enough lifeboats. The Titanic's tragedy was exacerbated by a series of warnings that were never properly addressed. Other ships in the area had sent repeated messages about dangerous ice fields floating ahead. Yet, in the Titanic's wireless room, those warnings did not get the attention they deserved. The operators were overwhelmed with personal messages sent by wealthy passengers, and safety alerts were often delayed or disregarded. Ballard could not see this failure in the wreck itself, but knowing about these missed signals made the twisted steel on the ocean floor even harder to accept. The disaster was not solely the result of natural forces. It was a chain of poor choices born from pride and carelessness. After the sinking, new myths quickly took hold. One of the most common claims was that the Titanic's hull had been ripped open by a huge gash, like a wound running along its side. Ballard's exploration proved otherwise. There was no giant tear in the metal. Instead, the iceberg had forced the seams between steel plates to open. Water rushed through narrow slits that spread quickly as rivets snapped and steel fractured in the cold. The ship did not lose its battle because of a single deep cut. It failed because of weak construction that gave way under pressure. The wreck also revealed the human cost in haunting detail. Scattered across the seabed were thousands of shoes, often lying in pairs. Leather lasts longer than fabric or bone, so these shoes have survived long after the bodies they belonged to disappeared. They marked the very spots where people had once rested on the ocean floor. Alongside them were suitcases, clothing, and other belongings. For Ballard, these were not just objects. Each one represented a life, a journey, and a story cut short. The Titanic was not only about broken steel and failed engineering. It was about people, men, women, and children, whose lives were lost because greed and arrogance had outweighed safety. The findings from the wreck also stirred up old suspicions. For years, some had claimed that the Titanic was not the ship that sank at all. According to this theory, she had been swapped with her nearly identical sister ship, the Olympic, as part of an insurance scheme that went terribly wrong. Supporters of the idea pointed to similarities between the two ships and the financial difficulties facing the White Star Line at the time. Robert Ballard never supported this claim, nor did he try to prove it. But once his discoveries showed that the official story of the sinking had been misleading, those who believed in the swap theory felt they had new reasons to doubt the truth. If authorities had misrepresented how the Titanic went down, what else might they have concealed? While conspiracy theories remained uncertain, Ballard's actual evidence was undeniable. His photographs, surveys, and the later studies of the ship's materials all told the same story. The Titanic was not just undone by an iceberg. The flaws were already inside her. She had been constructed with weak materials, launched with overconfidence, and operated with arrogance. When the night of disaster arrived, those flaws ensured that hundreds of lives would be lost. This, for Ballard, was the heavy truth he carried with him. The Titanic was not simply a dramatic tale of fate and courage. It was a disaster that could have been prevented, one created by human decisions and greed. On the ocean floor, nearly 2 miles down, the wreck sat in silence, holding evidence for anyone willing to face it. When Robert Ballard finally returned from his expedition in 1985, he believed the truth about the Titanic would force the world to see the tragedy differently. The news of the discovery captured worldwide attention. Headlines, photographs, and documentaries poured out, and Ballard's name became forever tied to the ship's story. Yet the uncomfortable details about poor construction and human negligence never received the same spotlight. Instead, the public and the media clung to the romance of the wreck. Newspapers focused on haunting images of the bow rising from the seabed, stories of ghosts on the ocean floor, and the courage of women and children stepping into lifeboats were retold. The Titanic was once again wrapped in legend and drama. At the same time, the harsher truths uncovered by Ballard faded into the background. The reason was simple: money and emotion. The Titanic had grown into a global symbol of human pride, tragic loss, and bravery in the face of disaster. That version of the story was marketable. It filled museums, inspired books, and later became the foundation for one of the most successful films of all time. To replace that narrative with one about greed, negligence, and cost-cutting would have destroyed the myth people wanted to believe. The public longed for a noble tragedy, not a corporate scandal. The sinking of the Titanic not only left behind grief at sea, it also brought legal battles on land. In the years that followed, families of the victims took White Star Line to court, hoping for justice. But the results were disappointing. Judges ruled in favor of the company, limiting the amount of compensation to sums so low they felt meaningless compared to the scale of lives lost. Decades later, when Robert Ballard uncovered signs of poor construction and ignored warnings, those findings could have reopened the question of who was at fault. Yet, no government wanted to revive an old scandal. Both in Britain and in America, leaders preferred to keep the past quiet rather than revisit mistakes made so long ago. Ballard's own journey to the wreck carried another layer of secrecy. On the surface, his expedition was celebrated as a scientific mission to locate the Titanic. However, behind the scenes, a significant portion of his funding and support came from the United States Navy. Their real interest was in locating two nuclear submarines that had sunk during the Cold War. By promoting the Titanic story, they created a perfect distraction, keeping the public focused on one of the world's most famous shipwrecks, while military operations went unnoticed. This raised difficult questions. If the Titanic mission was partly a cover for secret work, what else might have been hidden? Could items have been removed from the wreck before the public ever saw them? Were there sensitive documents or cargo on board that powerful groups preferred to keep secret? Ballard never claimed any of this himself, but the combination of military involvement and unanswered details gave rise to speculation. Rumors began to spread. Some said Ballard had come across objects that were never shown in photographs. Others believed that his team might have recovered pieces of the ship or sealed containers that were quietly handed over to officials and never made public. None of these claims was ever proven, yet the mystery surrounding the mission allowed such stories to take root and grow. Although Robert Ballard uncovered clear evidence of poor design, cheap materials, and careless decisions, those findings never gained the same attention as the haunting images of the Titanic's bow. The world admired the photographs, but the uncomfortable truth behind them was quietly set aside. Over the years, some reports and engineering studies emerged, examining the weak rivets, the brittle steel, and the ignored warnings about ice. Experts debated these issues, yet the wider public chose not to focus on them. In the end, the world chose the legend over the facts. Ballard had returned with proof, but it was a truth many preferred to ignore. And so the darker version of the Titanic story, the one marked in torn steel and shattered rivets, was left to rest quietly at the bottom of the Atlantic. Over the years, Ballard has often shared his thoughts about the ship. He has called it a memorial, a warning, and one of the greatest tragedies in history. Yet his words always carried a hidden weight. Beneath the public story of bravery and sacrifice lay the reality that the Titanic was never simply unlucky. It was also a victim of its own design. She was a ship weakened by shortcuts, launched in arrogance. She pushed into danger by decisions driven more by pride and money than by safety. The wreck itself revealed that the iceberg was only part of the disaster. Human choices carried just as much blame. In that way, the Titanic is more than a sunken liner. unanswered questions remain. Was the Titanic truly the ship that sank? Or does the theory about her being swapped with the Olympic carry fragments of truth? Did governments know more than they admitted? Did Ballard himself keep evidence hidden, either out of respect or under quiet pressure? The wreck offers no clear answers, and Ballard, now in the later years of his life, seems willing to let those mysteries remain. Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this video interesting, don't forget to like it. Subscribe for more in-depth explorations of history's mysteries, and ring the bell so you never miss the next one.